Do you want me to say hello or just say,
Sure,
yeah,
say hello. Love that.
hello? So my name is Kip Williams. I am the director and adapter of The Maids, playing at St Anne's Warehouse. Well, I've had quite a long relationship with The Maids. I first read it when I was a teenager and then revisited it when I was at university and drama school, and I always knew that I wanted to direct it at some point. But it was about 2 years ago that I revisited the work and was struck by the prophetic nature of it. How Genet was so acutely aware of the way in which we perform in our lives, and particularly the way in which society that is obsessed with appearances, obsessed with wealth, obsessed with power, is caught in this act of role-playing those ideas and ideals. And I found when I read the play most recently that this particular moment in human history, where human beings, I think by virtue of social media, are caught up almost in a perpetual act of performing and aspiring to these values, the play suddenly felt incredibly resonant and pertinent for an act of reimagining and retelling for this moment in time. So I took that inspiration and delved into the adaptation and worked with an incredible team and brought this production to life. I think when I first encountered the play, I was, I think, drawn to how theatrical it is. It's a work where there's a play within a play, and the characters on some level are always engaged in an active performance. I very much subscribe to that Wildian notion that life is one grand act of theatre, and each individual is caught always in a perpetual act of performance, shifting from audience to audience, depending on what section of society they might find themselves within. And I find that a fascinating way to think about life, that we can either choose to reveal ourselves or conceal ourselves, or sometimes do both within that act of performance. And Genet's play speaks to that conundrum and that phenomenon very directly. So I think as a theatre maker, or I think many theatre makers are obsessed with this work for that very reason. And so I guess initially it was that theatricality that drew me to the play. And over the years, I think as our lives have shifted and that as that active performance has become a more abstracted virtual experience within our lives with the advent of social media, my relationship to that notion of how we perform within our lives has shifted, and the play has taken on new resonances for me. I think particularly at this moment in time when we're able to access the lives of others and the lives of the top 1%, and particularly with this very visual form of communicating with each other that is so embedded in our lives, I suppose creating an obsession with the superficial aspects of modern living, it has, I think, focused my attention within the play upon those aspects and really drawn me to tell a story that illuminates those aspects of the work, and I think frame it in a context that feels very true to the lives that we're living in right now. When I came to adapt the play, I always knew that I wanted to incorporate contemporary technology into it. I very much subscribe to the notion that theatre should hold the mirror up to nature, that Shakespearean idea. And I find it difficult to tell stories today without grappling with the way in which this technology is becoming increasingly enmeshed within our lives and the way that we communicate with each other. So on some level, when you come to read The Maids and think about staging it in 2026, you have to grapple with the way in which that technology intersects with the way in which we perform our identities. One of the big questions became, how was that technology going to manifest within the work? Um, I knew that I wanted to embark upon a use of video in the piece that was quite different from how I usually use it. Usually the video in my work has a kind of theatre machine that films the performer within it. This is a very different approach towards the use of video. All of it is, I suppose, a kind of diegetic use of video. It is an act of the characters filming themselves. So there isn't a kind of exterior meta theatre device that is capturing the performers. It's all video work that's generated from the performers themselves. And so within that became a kind of question of, well, how does that video content get relayed to the audience? And how does it affect the world of the characters themselves? And the design team and I landed upon the screens and the mirrors being the kind of intersection of the reality of the play and then this sort of extra expressive theatrical device of the video. And it's really fascinating, I think, because the mirrors in a literal sense are a device within our lives that reflect back a truth of who we are. So no matter how much you may wish to perform or curate a different version of yourselves, the mirror is always going to show you the truth of who you're presenting. The mirrors in the world of this play are also a portal to a form of transformation. They give you access to the costumes, to the dresses, the wigs, the makeup, the jewelry, the shoes of Madame, and they allow the maids to dream of themselves as being something other than what they are. So there's a kind of metamorphosis that going through these mirrored cupboards allows and permits our characters. And so that sort of opened up another way of thinking about how the mirrors could work, and that actually they could be both a portal to truth in reflecting back what is, but also be a portal of transformation in the way in which what is contained behind those mirrors is a thing that permits transformation. And so with that thinking in play, I conceived of this version where these mirrors could be two-way glass, and at moments when the cameras start to get used, the mobile phones start to get used, the video imagery could come through those mirrors, and suddenly these kind of literal portals to transformation could become more theatrically expressive portals of transformation as well. I believe that this play has been done as a one-person show before, which sort of feels bonkers and kind of incredible to me. Uh, Look, I think what's interesting in the way in which I approached the Maids versus the Cinetheatre trilogy of works that I've made, those being The Picture of Dorian Gray, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and Dracula, is that in the trilogy of works, there is this relationship between artifice and reality that is expressed directly to the audience from the get-go. Those productions start in an empty space, essentially in a theatre space, where the artifice of theatre making is made and foregrounded for the audience in a very direct way. The Maids, I approached it with an inverse theatrical dramaturgy. We start in an incredibly real space. In fact, Rosanna Vise and I, quite late in the design process, conceived of having this diaphanous curtain that surrounds the stage space from the get-go, so that you really feel like you're peering through a fourth wall into this incredibly real space. And then in inverse to the Cinetheatre trilogy, the further you move through the story, the more that reality gets deconstructed and stripped back, until by the end of the piece, the theatrical artifice is made manifest for the audience. And essentially, Solange, our character Solange's mantra of "none of this is real" is made explicit, and that's been a fascinating way to approach the telling of this story. It's quite unusual for me, actually. Most of my pieces of theatre, irrespective of whether I'm using video or not, start with a kind of Peter Brook-esque act of declaring the empty space, and in doing so inviting an audience's imagination into that space to make that story that we're about to share in a real thing. For me, that makes the audience more active. It makes their imaginative leap of faith greater, and therefore I think embeds them and invests them more deeply within the work. And I think for me, I'm so interested in the way in which theatre is always an act of artifice that I always want to start in that space. So it's quite a radical departure for me, this production, to start in a work that is essentially, from the get-go, a piece of naturalism. But it's because this piece is so intensely aware of the way in which life is an act of performance that we decided to posit something that was, for all intents and purposes, extraordinarily real, that we could then deconstruct and reveal the artifice that exists within that. And I think that speaks to the conundrum of the play, and the conundrum that the characters are caught within this narrative, that they're desperately trying to deny the truth of what their life is, that the paradox of them both wanting to destroy their Madame and become their Madame leaves them in this sort of fantasy universe where they're deeply disempowered. They're kind of rendered paralyzed by that paradox, by the contradiction of knowing that something is wrong, but also wanting to reinforce it by becoming it themselves. And I think that creates a kind of a very artificial existence, one where the truth of who you are is disjointed from the way that you express that in the world around you. So we really wanted to start by positing that reality as something that felt concrete, and then to take that away from both the audience and the characters, and I think in a kind of tragic sense, leave us in the abyss, I suppose, at the end of not having a concrete reality around us, because what we have invested in ultimately hasn't been true, hasn't been authentic, and I think at the end of the day, the piece expresses to the audience a provocation that the only way to have a concrete reality is to express the authentic, is to stay true to who you actually are, and that if we sacrifice that, or make concessions of that, or betray that in certain ways, then our reality will betray us. Yes, my Instagram algorithm really changed quite a lot in the 12 months whilst I was working on this project, because I did deep dive quite far and scarily into the world of social media influencers, into TikTok, into the kind of cultural bedrock of this obsession with youth and beauty and materialism, that this new technology has not created our obsession with, but exacerbated our obsession with, or given us kind of newfound access to express that obsession with, and created a dominance of those values within our lives. So it was a kind of, fascinating, terrifying deep dive, and there's an extent to which my algorithm hasn't quite recovered yet. I get a lot of videos about Labubu and glitter dumpling reveals in my reels at the moment. Um, but it was really important to do that. I think in part because one of the big departures of my adaptation is to write Madame in a way that, I think, and certainly the response has indicated as such, gives an authentic voice to Gen Z. I'm a millennial, although I love Gen Z and have respect for all generations. But I was really interested in tapping into the kind of generation that is one after myself, that has a real facility with technology that is kind of like far beyond the millennial facility with it. I think millennials encountered social media in their late teens and early 20s, and it was a sort of adaptive social process, whereas Gen Z has had it embedded in their lives from, childhood onwards. There's a facility with the rules of it, the power of it, and I think the perils of it, that really fascinates me. And so Madame had to feel incredibly authentic to that world, and the rhythm of how she spoke, and the ideas that she contained. And I think one of the things that I like about the adaptation is that it both critiques that paradigm, but also I think is one of the more empathetic renderings of Madame than perhaps what you usually get within the Maids, because of course she's an incredibly cruel figure. But in this production, I think by virtue of shifting the focus from a kind of class power structure to a more economic, financial driven power structure that generates, I think, within our lives, profound disparities between privilege and underprivilege, Madame herself has been able to um, conquer that paradigm and wield it to her own advantage, but she's also a victim of it as well. And particularly in the events of the play that we encounter, on stage, she's at a point where she is radically becoming disposed by the paradigm that has put her right on the top. So I think, the production is really clear in critiquing the pursuit of those values in the way in which Genet is critiquing the pursuit of those values 80 years ago. I think what's fascinating about doing so today is that Genet almost prophetically peered into the future and understood the way that we might unravel if we fixated so heavily upon them, without perhaps knowing that the mobile phone was coming along. Uh, but I think today we're kind of living in the apotheosis of those values, and part of the reason to stage this play today is to peer with honesty into what those values are doing to our lives. Yes, I mean, I need to be clear in saying that I'm not anti-social media, and I'm certainly not anti this technology in totality. I think there are many extraordinary virtues to it. Um, one of the things that I think has been extraordinary about what social media and the internet and mobile phones has done is that it's allowed previously disconnected minorities to coalesce in a virtual space and find collective power. So in many ways, as human beings, congregating in the virtual has allowed a groundswell of communication, connection, and collective voice building that has created extraordinary progress in the last 10 years. And I love the internet for that. Um, at the same time, one of the things I'm most concerned about and is expressed within this work and a number of the pieces that I've made is the way in which the technology itself and the very nature of how we're asked to communicate within that particular technology detaches us from what I think are some core human experiences, one of which is looking into the eyes of another person. It is predisposed to dehumanizing other people at times because you're not sitting in the same space as somebody else. So that concerns me about it. The other thing that really concerns me about it, which I think is reflected on within the Maids, is that a visual way of expressing, like Instagram or TikTok or a, a, a condensed text-based way of communicating, like X, for me is fundamentally predisposed towards simple lies over complex truths. And I think by virtue of how fast we're expected to consume information and exchange information today as a result of this technology, and by virtue of the way in which that technology can be manipulated, we find ourselves in a kind of socio-political hall of mirrors where it's very easy to be manipulated, where it's very easy to, as I said, express and land a simple lie over a complex truth. And I lament the loss of complexity that has come at times as a result. So there's this incredible paradox socially that I see happening as a result of this technology. On one hand, we have this incredible advancement of communication with one another and the ability to connect and communicate with people in a way that we were never able to before. And we see great change coming from that. At the same time, it's a device that can be used to manipulate, to abstract us from our humanity, to deconstruct community. And I see those two things happening simultaneously in equal ways. And it concerns me that the latter happens. And in many ways, I see these characters and that kind of paradox that I spoke to before that exists so powerfully within the two of them as great examples of this conundrum that we're grappling with today. I hope the production in some ways allows us to reflect upon that and to perhaps reconsider the ways in which we might choose to engage with one another. So I knew coming into the show that there was going to be use of mobile phones, and there are certain moments that were scripted as to where that might happen. One of the beauties of creating this show, and I'm indebted to the Donmar warehouse for the very supported rehearsal room that we had, was that we had the cameras on the floor from day one of rehearsals. And so we were trying out these moments that I'd offered within the script as to where the filming might happen. But because the use of camera and mobile phone in this show is entirely driven by character, it had to be moments that felt wedded to and embedded in the instincts of the actors who were playing those characters. So we had an incredible opportunity on the rehearsal room floor to play with those devices and to expand upon the offers that I'd put within the script. It's a really complex thing that those actors have to do. As I said, usually my shows have an external camera team who I work with and choreograph and choose the cinematography for. It puts an extra level of complexity for the cast when they're bringing this show to life each night in having that technology to navigate. But because it's always driven by character choice, because it's something that comes out of the logic of the imaginary world of the play, there's a kind of organic quality to how it expresses itself within the piece. And I think that's something that was really important about this production's reflection on our contemporary lives, was that the video, it had to feel organic to the character's action in the way in which these devices are so kind of connected to our bodies in every moment of our lives. And we often will be in conversation with somebody, but actually looking at a mobile phone at the same time whilst we're talking to the person who's sitting next to us on the couch. So that was a wonderful part of the rehearsal process, to get to play with that technology and to really embed it into the lives and organic instincts of the performers. And Lydia and Phia and Yerin were extraordinary in the way that they played with that in the rehearsal room, and we also had a lot of fun. Well, we've continued to evolve the show since its premiere season at the Donmar in London last year, in part because the show seeks to speak directly to the current cultural pulse. So there are certain cultural references that have been updated, but also our relationship to technology and our particular social, political, cultural climate shifts quite rapidly today. So we've wanted to make changes that have responded to what's happening in the world right now. Um, and then also, it's a kind of beautiful thing to get to revisit a play after a season. Both the cast and the creative team and I have all had ideas about where we might want to take things further, or certain moments that we might want to expand, or things that we might want to cut because it worked in London, but now the world is different. And that's an incredibly exciting part of the process. Also, for me as a theatre maker, one of the things that defines theatre is that it takes place in space. So I'm always thinking about the way in which the story is responding very directly to the theatre in which it's set. In the Donmar warehouse, it's a very intimate room. You really felt like you're sitting inside the bedroom with the maids and with Madame. And there was something almost kind of overwhelming about how the screens operated within that room. In the beautiful kind of scale and grandeur of the St. Anne's warehouse, this beautiful, beautiful building, the room sits more like an installation. There's more space around it. And funny enough, that fundamentally does something to the theatricality of the work. It actually invites, on some level, an even more theatrical, grander, expressive quality to the performances. In many ways, by virtue of the audience being larger and in this bigger space, I think the kind of core theatrical spirit of Genet's work is expanded within this room. So it's been really exciting to retune it, and also to bring it to New York audience as well, because if fundamentally on some levels this adaptation, even though it premiered in the UK where there is a intense discourse around class, as an Australian adapting this work, and definitely there is class structure in every culture in the world in various different ways. But the class structure that I grew up in, and I think the certainly it is closer to the capitalist paradigm that I also think resonates really powerfully in America. So it's kind of extraordinary to bring this show to New York when it's speaking so directly, I think, to the ideas and the paradigms and the values that are emanating from the cultural powerhouse that is America. And it's really exciting to see American audiences responding to it in the way that they are. So I have the most extraordinary cast in this production of The Maids. I have the great Lydia Wilson, who I've been the hugest fan of since I saw her in "'Tis Pity" back in Sydney in 2012, and thrilled to be working with her. The glorious Phia Saban, who plays Solange, opposite Lydia's Claire, who is the most gifted young performer. And then the phenomenal Yerin Ha, who I've had the great pleasure of working with once before, who is giving this powerhouse performance as Madame. This piece really is an actor's work. It's one room, three actors, and these three performers go off like dynamite in this production. They continue to blow my mind every time I see them. I've had the great privilege of sitting with them in this work for nearly a year now, and they still continue to surprise me night after night within this piece. I think what's so extraordinary about the three of them is that they navigate the multi-layers of this work with such delicacy and proficiency. So at every point in time, these characters are playing kind of multiple levels, whether they're in the ceremony and the game, whether they're in Madame and withholding things from her, and Madame herself, both performing the idea of publicly of who people think she is and then dropping her mask at times. And Lydia, Phia, and Yerin navigate those layers with such dexterity and with such kind of thrilling danger every night. It's an incredibly complex work. It's a work that asks them technically to do so much, but it also is a piece that asks them to give really of the depths of their soul. And it's a deeply moving piece. and I'm so in awe of the three of them and what they do within it. I love them. St. Anne's Warehouse is one of the most exciting spaces to get to tell a story in the world because it has an incredible audience who is highly theatre literate, highly adventurous. And I think that is a testament to the programming over many decades of this company. It's a company that curates and originates work that is bold and adventurous, and I think in all instances having a conversation about the lives that we're living right now. So to be invited to bring this work into this building and to share that work with St. Anne's audiences and the audiences of New York is a huge privilege. And all of us have been incredibly excited to get to do that and been so beautifully welcomed by this wonderful company. And yeah, what a privilege to get to share our story here. I'm Kip Williams. I'm the writer and director of this adaptation of The Maids, playing at St. Anne's Warehouse until June 14. Come and see us.